was past midnight on July 16th, 2010, when 20 figures in white surgeons' outfits entered the most sacred building in Venezuela. They moved through the National Pantheon in Caracas, a neoclassical temple originally built as a church, transformed in 1876 into the final resting place of Venezuela's founding fathers. And tonight they had come for the bones of the greatest of them all, Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, the man who freed 6 nations from Spanish colonial rule. The George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Napoleon Bonaparte of South America all rolled into one mythical figure. For 180 years, Bolívar's remains had rested in an ornate sarcophagus beneath a bronze altar, undisturbed. Every Venezuelan government had claimed his legacy, invoked his name, draped themselves in his symbolism, but none had dared to actually open the coffin, until now. As a stunned nation watched on live television, broadcast at 3 a.m. without prior announcement, the coffin was opened, the skeleton was pulled apart, pieces were removed, teeth, bone fragments, for what the government called testing. The remains were placed in a new coffin bearing the seal of the current government, and presiding over it all, narrating the event in his inimitable style, was President Hugo Chávez Frias. My God, Chávez tweeted that night. I confess we have cried, we have sworn. This glorious skeleton must be Bolívar because you can feel his ardor. He spoke directly to the bones. Father, is that you, or who are you? He asked the skull, and then answered himself. My heart told me it is me. He asked Christ to repeat the Lazarus miracle and raise the dead once more. By presidential decree, every television station in Venezuela had been commanded to show this. First, images of Bolívar in historic paintings, then images of the skeleton, then images of Chávez, the national anthem blaring throughout. The message was unmistakable. Chávez wasn't just a follower of Bolívar. He was Bolívar, reincarnated, returned. The official justification was scientific. Chávez claimed he suspected Bolívar had been assassinated by Colombian oligarchs, poisoned by his enemies, and that DNA testing would prove it. The coffin needed replacing anyway, he said. But across Venezuela and around the world, people whispered about a very different explanation. One involving ancestor worship, Afro-Caribbean spirits, and the darkest corners of syncretic religion. What if Hugo Chávez wasn't looking for evidence of assassination? What if he wanted the bones themselves? Before we can understand why anyone would want to dig up Bolívar's bones, we need to understand who Bolívar was and what he became in the Venezuelan imagination. Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad. Bolívar Palacios Ponte y Blanco was born on July 24, 1783 in Caracas into unimaginable wealth. His family were criollos, ethnically Spanish, but born in the Americas. They owned vast estates, enslaved thousands of people, and counted their wealth in generations of accumulated colonial privilege. By the time Simón was 9 years old, both his parents were dead, claimed by tuberculosis, the disease that would haunt his entire family line. Orphaned but enormously wealthy, he was educated by private tutors, the most influential being Simón Rodriguez, a radical intellectual who introduced young Bolívar to Enlightenment philosophy. Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu. At 16, Bolívar was sent to Europe to complete his education. In Madrid, he fell in love with and married Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Alaiza. They returned to Venezuela together in 1802. Within 8 months, she was dead from yellow fever. Bolívar never remarried. He threw himself back into travel, back into reading, back into the dangerous ideas of liberty and revolution that were sweeping the Atlantic world. In 1805, standing on a hill in Rome, he made a famous vow. He would not rest until he had freed his homeland from Spanish tyranny. What followed was 20 years of almost unimaginable military achievement. Bolívar became the central figure in the wars of independence that swept South America from 1810 to 1830. He crossed the Andes. He commanded armies across impossible terrain. He lost battles, lost republics, went into exile, and always came back. In August 1813, he marched into Caracas to cheering crowds. They gave him the title that would define him forever, El Libertador, the Liberator. He issued the decree of war to the death. Any Spanish-born person who did not actively support independence would be executed. It was brutal. It was effective. The war became existential. By 1819, he had liberated what is now Colombia. By 1821, Venezuela and Panama. By 1822, Ecuador. By 1824, Peru. By 1825, he had created an entirely new country, named in a moment of stunning ego, Bolivia. At his peak, Simón Bolívar was simultaneously president of 3 nations, Gran Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. He had ridden over 75,000 miles on horseback. He had personally commanded armies across a continent. He had done something no one in history had done before or has done since. And then it all fell apart. Gran Colombia, his dream of a unified South American republic, began fragmenting almost immediately. Regional rivalries, personal ambitions, and the impossible geography of ruling a continent by horseback tore it apart. Venezuela seceded. Ecuador seceded. His closest allies turned against him. In September 1828, assassins nearly killed him in Bogotá. His mistress, Manuela Sáenz, saved his life by delaying the attackers while he escaped through a window. By 1830, the crowds that once cheered him were calling him a tyrant. He resigned the presidency in April. He was 46 years old, broken in health, and virtually penniless. He had spent his entire fortune on the wars of independence. He planned to sail into exile in Europe. He never made it. On December 17, 1830, at a small estate called the Quinta de San Pedro Alejandrino near Santa Marta, Colombia, Simón Bolívar died. He was 47 years old. His physician recorded the cause of death as tuberculosis. Shortly before his death, Bolívar reportedly asked his doctor, "How will I ever get out of this labyrinth?" His final written words were even more bitter. "America is ungovernable. He who serves a revolution is plowing the sea." They buried him in a borrowed shirt in the Cathedral of Santa Marta. In 1842, his remains were moved to Caracas. In 1876, they were transferred to the newly built National Pantheon, where they would rest for 134 years, until Hugo Chávez decided he had questions that needed answering. Hugo Rafael Chávez Frias was born on July 28, 1954, in Sabaneta, a small village in the rural state of Barinas. His parents were both schoolteachers. They were not wealthy. As a military cadet in the early 1970s, Chávez discovered Bolívar, not just as a historical figure. He had grown up knowing that story, as all Venezuelans did, but as a personal obsession. He devoured everything he could find about El Libertador. He memorized his speeches. He studied his military campaigns. He began to see himself as Bolívar's spiritual heir. In 1982, Chávez founded a secret movement within the Venezuelan military. He called it MBR 200, the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement 200. The 200 commemorated what would have been Bolívar's bicentennial. The late 1980s brought economic catastrophe to Venezuela. Oil prices crashed. The government implemented brutal austerity measures. In February 1989, riots erupted in Caracas, the Caracazo, and the government killed hundreds, perhaps thousands, of its own citizens in the crackdown. On February 4th, 1992, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez and his MBR 200 attempted a coup d'etat against President Carlos Andrés Pérez. It failed spectacularly. The conspirators couldn't capture the president. Their pre-recorded message urging civilian support never made it to the airwaves. Chávez surrendered, but the government made a critical mistake. They let him go on television to tell his co-conspirators to lay down their arms. What he actually said made him famous. Por ahora, he said, for now. For now, our objectives have not been achieved. For now, those two words, por ahora, transformed a failed putschist into a folk hero. He was imprisoned for 2 years, then pardoned, and when he ran for president in 1998, he won in a landslide. From day one, Chávez wrapped himself in Bolivar's mantle. He renamed the country the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. He called his political movement the Bolivarian Revolution. He spoke under portraits of Bolívar. He quoted Bolívar constantly. He had Bolívar's sword brought from the central bank for his personal use. And here's where it gets strange. Chávez began leaving an empty chair at cabinet meetings. The chair, he said, was for Bolívar's spirit. He presented replicas of Bolívar's sword to his allies around the world: Fidel Castro, Vladimir Putin, Robert Mugabe, Muammar Gaddafi, Alexander Lukashenko, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The sword became a symbol of anti-imperialist solidarity, passed from the hand of El Libertador to the hands of whichever strongmen Chávez considered his ideological brothers. Using Venezuela's massive oil wealth, Chávez funded social programs, the Bolivarian missions, that provided healthcare, education, and food subsidies to the poor. His popularity soared. His critics called him a demagogue. His supporters called him the second coming of Bolívar himself. But there was always something else running beneath the surface of Chávez's Bolivarian devotion, something that took root during his imprisonment, deepened during his rise to power, and would eventually lead him to open the coffin of a man dead for nearly 2 centuries. To understand that, we need to talk about the spirits. In northwestern Venezuela, in the cloud forests of Yaracuy State, there is a mountain called Sorte. Every year, tens of thousands of pilgrims climb its slopes seeking something that no church, no hospital, no government can provide. They come to commune with the spirits. The dominant cult in Venezuela is devoted to Maria Leonza, a goddess whose origins are lost in the collision of indigenous, African, and European beliefs that created Venezuelan folk religion. In some stories, she was a green-eyed indigenous princess, sacrificed to a giant anaconda and transformed into a nature goddess. In others, she was the daughter of a Spanish conquistador who fled to the forest. Her statue, naked, riding a tapir, breasts bare, arms raised, guards a major highway intersection in Caracas. Devotees dodge traffic to lay flowers at her feet. Maria Leonza commands a spiritual court of thousands of entities organized into courts or hierarchies. There is the court of Africans, the court of Indians, the court of the Vikings, yes, Vikings, and crucially, there is the Liberator's Court, populated by the spirits of Venezuelan independence heroes, including, at its head, Simón Bolívar. In Maria Leonza practice, mediums allow spirits to possess them. They speak prophecies, offer advice, perform healings. The spirits are honored with offerings, tobacco, rum, fruit, coins. They are petitioned for help with everything from love troubles to legal problems to political fortune. And Venezuelan political leaders, including Hugo Chávez, have associated themselves with this cult for decades. But Maria Leonza is not the only spiritual tradition at play here. When thousands of Cuban doctors and advisors flooded into Venezuela as part of Chávez's oil for services agreement with Fidel Castro, they brought their religion with them. Santeria, the Afro-Cuban religion that blends Yoruba beliefs with Catholicism, exploded in popularity. Suddenly, Venezuelans who had grown up with Maria Leonza were also consulting Babalawos, Santeria priests who read the future through cowrie shells and perform animal sacrifices to the Orishas, the Yoruba gods syncretized with Catholic saints. And alongside Santeria came something darker, Palo Mayombe. Palo Mayombe, also known as Palo Monte or Las Reglas de Congo, is an Afro-Cuban religion with roots in the Congo traditions of Central Africa. It is older than Santeria in Cuba, and it has a fearsome reputation. At the center of Palo practice is the nganga, a ritual cauldron, usually iron, that contains the physical presence of a spirit. The nganga is filled with sticks, earth, feathers, coins, chains, railroad spikes, and other ritual objects, and human bones. Specifically, a human skull is considered essential. The bone captures the spirit of the deceased and becomes the source of the practitioner's power. In exchange for blood sacrifices and offerings, the spirit bound to the nganga will do the Palero's bidding for good or for ill. Not just any bones will do. Paleros seek out the bones of the powerful, the violent, the restless dead. The spirit of a murderer, it is believed, will not hesitate to perform malevolent acts. The spirit of a great leader will confer power upon the one who possesses his remains. In Cuba, in Venezuela, in the United States, Paleros have been arrested for grave robbery, for stealing bones from cemeteries to construct their ngangas. The price of a complete human skeleton in Cuba can reach 12,000 pesos. A skull alone might cost thousands. Now, consider what the bones of Simón Bolívar, El Libertador, the most powerful figure in Venezuelan history, a man who commanded armies across a continent, might be worth to someone who believed in this tradition. Consider what power those bones might be believed to contain. The rumors about Hugo Chávez and the occult began early and never stopped. According to journalist David Placer, who spent 3 years interviewing more than 70 people in Chávez's inner circle for his book Los Brujos de Chávez, The Sorcerers of Chávez, the future president's involvement with spiritualism began during his imprisonment following the failed 1992 coup. Fellow coup plotter, Captain Luis Valderrama, who was imprisoned alongside Chávez, later described what he witnessed. This is a man who gives exorcism, spiritualism, and all this kind of practice a supreme value. In Yare prison, we lived many experiences in the world of Santeria, bordering on sorcery and witchcraft. Chávez allegedly held spiritualist sessions in which he channeled the liberators, the spirits of Bolívar, and other independence heroes who spoke through him and recommended that he become the leader of the revolutionary movement. After his release from prison, Chávez traveled to Cuba in 1994. It was there, according to multiple sources, that he was formally initiated into Santeria. A Cuban santero named Carlos Valdés, who fled to Miami in 1994, claims to have witnessed Chávez's initiation ceremony in Cojimar, a coastal town near Havana. According to Valdés, Chávez fed the saints, performed animal sacrifices to the Orishas. The connection allegedly deepened from there. According to former Venezuelan defense minister Raúl Baduel, who would later break with Chávez and be imprisoned, the Cuban government began using santeros as intelligence assets. The line between spiritual consultation and political manipulation blurred. Cuban intelligence begins the infiltration with Santeria, one source told Placer. In the end, it changes the structures of society, and all those who are involved in the religion think and act like Cubans. Once Chávez came to power, rumors of occult practices at Miraflores presidential palace became persistent. International santeros reportedly held consultations with the president and his inner circle. Military and security officials attended ceremonies and received spiritual readings. One prediction, delivered by a group of santeros from a hotel in Maracay, warned that Chávez would be very insecure. His inner circle demanded clarification. Was this warning of a coup, a conspiracy, an assassination attempt? The santeros replied that it was simply a revelation from Ifa, the ancestral oracle of Yoruba tradition. But there's a specific detail that becomes crucial when we consider the exhumation. According to practitioners who spoke to researchers and journalists, there exists in the world of Santeria an oral tradition about Simón Bolívar himself. The story claims that during Bolívar's time in Haiti in 1816, when he received military support from Haitian revolutionary leader Alexandre Pétion, Bolívar was initiated into Vodou, that he was bathed in the blood of a bull, that this ritual gave him the spiritual power to achieve his military victories. There is no historical evidence for this claim, but if Chávez believed it, If he believed that Bolivar's bones contained not just symbolic but actual spiritual power, then the exhumation takes on an entirely different meaning. Santos Lopez, a renowned Venezuelan santero who had received government support for spiritual festivals, watched the 2010 exhumation broadcast with professional eyes. It was a moment of public confession, he said, an all-out Palo rite, the climax of the worship of the ancestors, the natives. Night belongs to the dead. All the santeros know this, and Chavez also knew it. That is why he does it at dawn. It is part of the common Venezuelan experience talking to the dead, and he followed the archetype, the timing, the secrecy, the white garments, the handling of the bones, the conversation with the skull. To practitioners of Afro-Caribbean religion, the exhumation was recognizable as something very specific, a ritual to claim the power of the dead. Of course, the Chavez government had an official explanation. It was purely scientific, they insisted, forensic, historical. Earlier in 2010, Dr. Paul Alverta of Johns Hopkins University had presented research at a medical conference suggesting that Bolivar may not have died of tuberculosis after all. Based on historical records and the autopsy report from 1830, Alverta proposed that arsenic poisoning might have been the actual cause of death. Crucially, Alverta did not suggest assassination. He believed Bolivar likely poisoned himself accidentally through arsenic-contaminated water in the regions where he campaigned, or through arsenic compounds used as medical treatments at the time. President Chavez and I share the belief that tuberculosis was not the cause of Bolivar's death, Alverta said. However, our explanations for how he did die couldn't be more different. Chavez seized on the arsenic theory, but rejected the accidental explanation. In my heart, for years, I've had the conviction that Bolivar didn't die of tuberculosis, he declared. I think they assassinated him. The culprits, he suggested, were Colombian oligarchs, enemies of the revolution, enemies of the people, the same enemies Chavez saw arrayed against himself. The exhumation produced a year-long forensic investigation. CT scans were performed on the skull. DNA samples were extracted from teeth and bones. Maria Antonia Bolivar, Simon's older sister, was also exhumed to provide comparison DNA. The remains were placed in a new coffin, a metricarat urn, vacuum sealed and bolted with gold screws from Guyana, then placed in a cedarwood container bearing the national shield in gold. It was, in every sense, a new reliquary for a political saint. In July 2012, Chavez unveiled new 3D facial reconstructions of Bolivar based on the skull scans, showing a darker-skinned, more indigenous-looking Libertador than the Europeanized portraits that had dominated Venezuelan iconography for nearly 2 centuries. But what about the assassination theory? What did the forensic investigation actually find? In July 2011, Vice President Elias Yawa delivered the results in a televised ceremony. We could not establish that the death was by non-natural means or by intentional poisoning. None of those who say this could prove it. The investigation was inconclusive. After all the pageantry, all the expense, all the controversy, they could not prove assassination. They could not even definitively rule out tuberculosis. Chavez was undeterred. I think they murdered him, he said. I don't have proof. I don't know if we will have, but those are the circumstances. Critics noted that the Venezuelan National Academy of History had not been consulted. No independent experts had overseen the investigation. No one could say with certainty what had been done with all the bone fragments that were removed. The government's seal was now on Bolivar's coffin, and Chavez, his popularity flagging, facing a difficult re-election campaign in 2012, had linked himself to Bolivar in the most intimate way possible, not just as an inheritor of his ideology, as the guardian of his physical remains. Almost immediately after the exhumation, things began to go wrong. Explosions rocked state-owned industries. Aircraft crashed. Prominent government figures died from disease and accidents in numbers that seemed to many Venezuelans to exceed the bounds of coincidence. Whispers spread through Venezuelan society, from the elite salons of Caracas to the poorest barrios. The curse of Bolivar. Chavez had disturbed the dead. The dead were taking their revenge. In June 2011, Chavez announced that he had been diagnosed with cancer. He had undergone emergency surgery in Cuba, The exact type and stage of the cancer were never fully disclosed to the Venezuelan public. For Chávez's opponents, the cancer was cosmic justice. Some have gone so far to say that Chávez's illness is a curse bestowed upon him for opening Bolívar's casket, reported the Christian Science Monitor. Strange incidents multiplied around Venezuela's Santeria and Palo communities. In January 2013, a captive ocelot at a Caracas zoo was found mutilated, its front feet severed, presumably for ritualistic purposes. A man in Táchira state reportedly sacrificed his own elderly mother, telling police that God had assured him such a sacrifice would heal President Chávez. On March 5, 2013, Hugo Chávez died. He was 58 years old. He had survived less than 3 years after opening Simón Bolívar's coffin. Before his death, Chávez had commissioned something extraordinary, a new mausoleum for Bolívar, a massive $130 million structure rising over the historic center of Caracas. A 170-foot high, brilliant white edifice shaped like a ramp leading to a convex wall. Critics immediately suspected the mausoleum wasn't really for Bolívar. "It's Chávez's future mausoleum," said José Jiménez, a university professor. "They are pushing for his remains to lie next to Bolívar, to put Chávez's legacy next to that of Bolívar." The government never confirmed or denied these suspicions. Chávez's body was ultimately preserved and displayed in a military museum, not buried beside Bolívar, though plans for his final resting place have shifted multiple times. But the question lingers, what did Chávez really want from those bones? So what really happened on that night in July 2010? We cannot know for certain. Hugo Chávez took his motivations to the grave. The investigation produced nothing conclusive. The bones rest in their new coffin under the government's seal. What we can say is this: the exhumation of Simón Bolívar was one of the strangest political spectacles of the 21st century. It combined forensic science with religious ritual, political theater with ancestor worship, modern media with beliefs as old as human civilization. At its most charitable interpretation, it was an attempt by a passionate believer to vindicate his hero, to prove that Bolívar died not from disease but from treachery, martyred by the same enemies Chávez saw everywhere around him. At its most cynical, it was a publicity stunt by a populist leader facing declining approval ratings, designed to literally fuse his identity with Venezuela's greatest historical figure. And at its most unsettling, it was exactly what Santos Lopez and other practitioners recognized: a ritual of power, an attempt to bind the spirit of a dead man to the service of a living one, to take possession of bones believed to contain the essence of a liberator and claim that essence for oneself. Every culture has rituals surrounding the remains of the powerful dead. Catholic churches display the bones of saints. The Soviets preserved Lenin in his mausoleum. Americans travel to Arlington Cemetery to stand at Kennedy's eternal flame. But there is something different about what Chávez did. He didn't just visit Bolívar's tomb. He didn't just honor the remains. He opened the coffin, pulled apart the skeleton, removed pieces, and had the whole thing broadcast to the nation at 3 a.m. while speaking directly to the bones and asking Christ for resurrection. This was not ordinary political symbolism. This was something else. Whether we interpret it through the lens of Palo Mayombe and its Nganga rituals, through Venezuelan folk religion and its spirit courts, through political theater and populist manipulation, or through simple personal obsession taken to its logical extreme, the message was the same. Hugo Chávez wanted to possess Simón Bolívar, not just his legacy, not just his symbolism, his very bones. Today, Venezuela remains in crisis. The Bolivarian Revolution has brought the country to economic collapse, mass emigration, and political chaos. Chávez's successor, Nicolás Maduro, clings to power through increasingly authoritarian means, and Simón Bolívar's remains rest in their government-sealed coffin in their new reliquary, guarded by a state that claims his name. The bones have been disturbed, the dead have been summoned. Whatever power they held, spiritual, symbolic, or purely imagined, has been claimed. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirit of El Libertador looks down on what has become of his legacy. the revolution that was supposed to free his people, the leader who opened his grave seeking power, the country that bears his name, and asks the same question he asked on his deathbed 2 centuries ago: how will I ever get out of this labyrinth? As this video was being finalized, history intervened in the most dramatic way imaginable. In the early hours of January 3rd, 2026, the United States launched a military operation against Venezuela. Explosions rocked Caracas before dawn. Attack helicopters swept over the capital. Delta Force operators descended on Fuerte Tiuna, the military complex where Nicolas Maduro had long been believed to live. By sunrise, President Donald Trump announced that Maduro and his wife Celia Flores had been captured and flown out of the country. The Venezuelan dictator, who had clung to power through stolen elections, brutal repression, and the systematic destruction of his country's economy, was on his way to a federal detention center in Brooklyn to face drug trafficking charges. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez called it an illegal and illegitimate kidnapping. Russia condemned it as an act of armed aggression. Trump called it a brilliant operation and announced that the United States would run Venezuela until a transition could be arranged. But among the military targets struck that night was one that sent shockwaves through Venezuela and Latin America far beyond any strategic consideration. The Cuartel de la Montaña, the mountain barracks, was hit. This was the military complex that had served as command center for Chávez's failed 1992 coup attempt. After his death in 2013, it had been transformed into his mausoleum. Hugo Chávez's remains had rested there in a granite sarcophagus atop a structure called the Flower of the Four Elements, guarded by an honor guard that changed every hour, saluted every afternoon by cannon fire. Now it was burning. Reports immediately emerged that the mausoleum had been deliberately targeted, that American forces had bombed not just military infrastructure, but the tomb of Chavismo's founding father. Video footage showed flames engulfing the complex. Social media exploded with images of smoke pouring from the site where Chávez's bones had lain. The Pentagon maintained the strike targeted command and communications facilities. The complex also housed the headquarters of the Bolivarian militia, located about 500 meters from the mausoleum itself. But the symbolism was impossible to miss. Whether the tomb was directly hit or merely caught in the destruction of the surrounding military infrastructure, the message reverberated across Latin America. On social media, reactions ranged from horror to jubilation. "Rest in ashes," wrote one American commentator. "Not even in death will you escape." Venezuelan opposition supporters celebrated. Chavistas denounced imperial aggression against the memory of the Bolivarian leader. Consider the arc of this story. In 2010, Hugo Chávez opened Simón Bolívar's coffin at midnight, removed pieces of the skeleton, and claimed the power of Venezuela's founding father for himself and his revolution. Many believed it was a ritual, an attempt to harness the spiritual force of ancestral bones. Chávez died less than 3 years later. His successor, Maduro, continued the cult of personality, the invocation of Bolívar, the mystical nationalism that had become inseparable from Venezuelan governance. And now, in January 2026, American bombs fell on the place where Chávez himself was buried. The man who disturbed Bolívar's rest had his own rest disturbed. The bones he believed contained power may have been scattered by the same forces of empire he spent his life denouncing. His political heir sits in a Brooklyn jail cell awaiting arraignment on narco-terrorism charges. The $50 million bounty on his head has been claimed. Venezuela, the country Chávez renamed for Bolívar, the country whose identity he tried to fuse with his own, is now, according to its captors, being run by Washington until further notice. Those who believe in curses will see confirmation. Those who don't will see the predictable end of authoritarian overreach. Those who practice the old religions may wonder what spirits were unleashed when Chávez opened that coffin 16 years ago, and whether the destruction of his own tomb represents their final vengeance or merely another turn in an endless cycle. In Palo Mayombe tradition, the bones of the powerful dead contain their essence, their force, their capacity to act in the world, To possess such bones is to command that power. To scatter them is to release it or destroy it. Chavez reached into Bolivar's coffin seeking power. Now someone has reached into his. The bones of the powerful dead, it seems, are never safe from the living, not Bolivar's, not Chavez's, and not perhaps the bones of whatever comes next.